Hello everyone, back to today's first video. We're doing the first Spring 2019 Analogues update for today's first video. So we are very late with the spring updates this year due to the shutdown in America. Well, in December we took December off because we had the long run through the autumn with the winter update, so we always like to take December off to sort of take stock of things a little bit, but we usually get the spring updates going in January. Due to the shutdown, it meant that NOAA, the reanalysis pages at NOAA went offline. We wasn't able to access them, and so we wasn't able to bring you any spring updates during January either. So it just leaves us with 1 month left to get all of the analogues in. Obviously, we're not going to be able to get everything in that we would normally look at through a season of updates. We're going to do our best to show you as much data as we can, and to try and get a spring forecast together. But it may not be possible, actually, to get a spring forecast out for you. It just depends how confident we are in the signals that we pick up with the analogues that we can do. So we'll let you know as the month goes on whether we are going to be able to bring you that spring forecast or not. This might be the first year ever in Gaz Weather's history, or the first season ever in Gaz Weather's history, that we aren't able to bring you a long-range forecast for the coming season. But we will do our best. We're going to try and get as much data together as we can. It just depends how confident we are at the end of the season of, well, the month of updates. So what we're going to look at today for the first season update, for the first Analogues update for Spring 2019 is December data. So we're going to look at the CET for December, and then we'll have a look at December rainfall, and we'll have a look at the springs, the Decembers that were similar, and then the springs that followed those December. It will all become apparent as I talk you through. Coming up later on today, around lunchtime, we're going to have Gaz Weather's Sunny Roundup. Later on this afternoon, we're going to have a little bit on summer. So summer updates will begin at Gaz Weather's in March. I've got a little update coming up this afternoon about the summer, and then tonight we're going to do an ensembles watch. So 4 videos for you today. I hope you find them all interesting and informative. Big thank you to our analogues guru James Ackrill for sending through these analogues for us, and I think we better get on because we've got so much to do today. I think we better get on with your first spring analogues update right now. So we're going to start off pretty much where we left off with winter updates. Actually, the first analogues we're going to look at are springs following on from the years that made up our winter analogues package. So these are the years. We've got 1913, 1914. That actually came out as the top analogue for our winter analogues and our winter forecast. Also got 1937, 1938, 1900, 1901, 1911, 1912, 1976, 1977, 1983, 84. We've got 95, 96, 2006, 7, 53, 54, 68, 69 was also quite a big year, 75, 76, 77, 78, and 84, 85. And of course, you may remember that out of those, the top 2 were, as I say, 1913 and also 1938, which kind of was hinting, pushing us a little bit towards a milder winter outcome. But anyway, we won't dwell on that. Let's get on with your spring update. So this is how the marches look that follow those years. So this is how the marches look that follow those winter analogues, those top winter analogues. And for March, it looks like it's a relatively unsettled signal with below average heights out to the west southwest of us, high pressure up to the north to the northeast. It is a bit of a northern blocking signal, but it's actually probably not overly cold with a lot of these marches. With a lot of them, we're probably bringing up winds from a southerly to southeasterly direction. So although there is a bit of a blocking signal in the marches of these winter analogues, overall probably not actually overly cold signal, though you could envisage with a fairly strong area of above average heights to the north, you could envisage that several of these marches probably are producing pretty cold months, but overall probably just fairly unsettled and reasonably mild. Big changes in the Aprils of these years. So we find that in the Aprils we get a large area of above average height setting up almost over top of the UK. So the Aprils look very settled. Low pressure is out in the Atlantic. Low pressure is also over to the northeast. And these are doing something like that with the flow with the jet stream. So a lot of dry weather and potentially quite warm Aprils as well, I would have thought, with that, with high pressure almost over top of the country. That could be a really nice signal for April. And then we go through into May, and May looks like this. So it tends to have an area of above average heights up to the northeast, below average heights across central parts of Europe. So favouring easterlies, really, in the Mays. Probably quite unsettled, but maybe not overly so, because the Atlantic is blocked off. May, excuse me, May does tend to be quite an easterly month anyway. So again, probably a fairly warmish signal, I would have thought, for May, with a fair amount of easterly winds. And probably not overly unsettled. The Atlantic does look as though it is blocked off in a lot of those Mays. Overall, this is how the springs themselves are looking. So they tend to have an area of above average height sitting to the north and below average heights sitting to the south. But I think within that, we possibly do have a relatively mild signal, really, for these springs, following on from our winter analogues. I think probably not overly unsettled either. It's not a strong signal for a raging Atlantic, and although southern parts perhaps are most unsettled overall with these springs, I think relatively speaking not too bad an analogues package if you're hoping for reasonably mild and warmish conditions during the spring. So next thing we'll look at is the CET. So this is the Central England temperature page from Gaza. It's starting at the year 1659, of course. Let's come down to 2018. We're going to try and find December 2018. So there's the year of 2018 just there. And there's December just there. December 2018 was a very mild month, coming out with Central England temperature of 6.9. So we've got to now look at other years that had a December within that range, and then look at what the springs were like that followed those Decembers. So our range of years is going to, our range of temperature, I should say, CT temperature, is going to be anything from 6.6 to 7.2, placing December 2018 at 6.9, bang in the middle of that range. So this is the first spring that we come out with. It's the spring of 1869, following on, of course, from the December of 1868, part of the warmest winter on record of 1868-1869. The spring of 1869 looks quite unsettled, with below average heights through the country. It was quite cold as well through March of 1869, I think. So although it was a very mild winter, warmest winter on record, actually we got to March, it did get quite cold. Overall, probably not an overly cold spring though, because it's not a particularly strong northern blocking signal, but just a very unsettled spring in 1869. The next spring is 1901, following on from December 1900. So the spring of 1901 looks like this. It tends to have above average heights to the north and below average heights to the south. Quite an unsettled spring. We've got a jet stream going down here. And we're probably pulling in quite a lot of easterlies during that spring as well. Of course, bear in mind, spring is a season that favours easterly winds, particularly in April and especially in May. May is our most easterly month of the year, and then in June you tend to get a return of the westerlies. So if we see a lot of easterly setups in this Analogues update, that is really what you expect to see in a typical spring, especially later on in the spring. And easterlies, of course, as you go further into spring, because it's a transitional season, they might start off cold in March, but by the time you get through to May, easterlies can actually be quite warm. So that's what we see for the spring of 1901. Looks like, again, probably not, although the below average heights are over to the south of the UK, it's possibly not overly unsettled because the Atlantic tends to be a little bit blocked off. So I would have thought unsettled at times and probably fairly warm, especially with later on in the season. Now, this does look genuinely very unsettled. This is the spring of 1901, following on from December 1912, and this has a really deep area of below average heights in 1913 over to the west of the UK, so you could really envisage a very unsettled spring there. I would have thought that's a very wet spring with low pressure coming in off the Atlantic in the spring of 1913. Our next spring is 1919, following on from the very mild December of 1918. This one also looking unsettled with a trough of below average height centred over the top of the country and quite a strong blocking signal up towards Greenland as well. So you'd have thought this is probably quite a cold and wet spring, quite cold and unsettled in the spring of 1919. Then through to 1925, following on from the very mild December of 1924. This one with below average heights over the UK and over much of central and Western Europe as well, above average heights through the middle of the Atlantic and going up towards Greenland. There looks like there's a trough within the 500 millibar flow, so that looks like it would be really quite an unsettled and potentially quite cool spring as well. The next spring is 1943, so this is following on from the mild December of 1942. This looks a nice spring. It has above average heights moving in from the Atlantic into the UK. We've got below average heights well to our north up across Greenland and Iceland. The jet stream is also going well to the north, so we're on the mild side of the jet. We're under a closer ridge of high pressure. That looks like it would be a very nice spring in 1943, a lot of dry and potentially warm weather there. I think April 1943 might have been really quite warm. Our next year is 1934, so this is the spring of 1954, I should say. This is the spring of 1954 with above average heights up to our north and northeast. Below average heights are in the Atlantic and to our south. This looks like a very easterly spring. So, again, bear in mind it's transitional. So, in March, easterlies are going to be cold. In May, easterlies will not be overly cold, except if you're right on the North Sea. And actually, by the time you get through to the end of May, easterlies can be potentially quite warm. So that looks like a relatively dry, easterly sort of spring. Starting off cold, probably getting milder later on. And then just through to 1955. So there's a run of mild Decembers through the middle of the 1950s. The first one was 1953. The next one is 1954. And this is the spring of 1955, setting up the pattern of the summer with above average heights centred over the top of the country, below average heights in the Atlantic being blocked out there. The flow and the jet is going something like that. 1955 was a very warm, quite a hot summer and dry, and the pattern begins to set up in the spring of 1955. 1972 is our next spring, following on from the very mild December of 1971. This one has below average heights over to the south of the UK, a little bit of a blocking signal up to the north. It looks like it's probably relatively unsettled, and I would have thought reasonably mild as well, really, in the spring of 1972. Now, putting all of those springs together, this is how the marches come out. So in the marches, we favour below average heights over and to the south of the UK. So unsettled signal down to our south, but not necessarily that unsettled to the UK, with above average heights tending to be out to the northwest. So it's quite a complicated pattern, but I think overall probably a little bit like that with the flow, with the jet stream. So I suspect there are a few colder marches in there, but to be honest, it doesn't look like a desperately cold pattern for the marches that we set up there. Probably just relatively average with temperatures, and I doubt that it's overly unsettled signal either. April looks okay. We've got below average heights up to our north around Greenland and going into Scandinavia, with above average heights just down to our southwest. So jet streams going through something like that. So relatively speaking, that looks like a fairly decent signal for April. You expect a reasonable amount of spring weather with that. Bearing in mind it's all years combined, so there will be years that are deviating from that pattern, but overall I think relatively pleasant in the Aprils, with a fair amount of dry weather, relatively warm, particularly so in the south. May looks a little bit more uncertain though. It looks like in May we set up a big area of low pressure in the Atlantic and possibly bring the jet stream through the country like that. So I think out of the three spring months, May is possibly the one that favours the most unsettled conditions, with clearly April favouring the warmest and driest weather on offer. If you put it all together, that's how the springs look. And it does look quite an unsettled signal, but bear in mind we have got a lot of intra-month variation there, and particularly in the Aprils you would expect a reasonable amount of dry and quite warm weather. Quite mild weather, and I think March overall isn't all that bad a signal either. So relatively speaking, I don't think these analogues are too bad for the springs really. There aren't that many of them, but it's suggesting particularly cold or wet conditions. The like the dodgiest month looks like it's probably going to be in May. And then we've got precipitation, so that's the next thing that we have to look at. So, in terms of precipitation, we're looking at England and Wales rainfall during December, coming out between 109 and 120 millimetres. And looking at past Decembers that had rainfall coming out at 109 to 120 millimetres, and the springs that followed them. So the first spring to look at with qualifying December is the spring of 1898. This one with below average heights over to the south of the UK, really strong blocking signal up to the north. So this could potentially be quite a cold spring, I would have thought, pulling down cold air into that trough of low pressure from that very strong blocking signal. The spring of 1898 looks like it would have been quite unsettled and potentially quite cold as well. The spring of 1908 turns up next, following on from the December of 1908 that had 109 to 120 millimetres. This one also kind of similar to the last spring, it's just looking at actually the spring of 1898, with below average heights centred over into the south of the country, and a bit of a blocking signal, reduced blocking, but a bit of a blocking signal up to the north. That's an interesting spring in 1908 because it did have an exceptionally late and severe blizzard at the end of April in 1908. Overall, possibly quite a cool and unsettled spring. Then we've got 1913 showing up again. So we just looked at 1913, of course, in terms of the CET. It's also turning up in terms of the precipitation, rainfall. So obviously for this particular analogues package, 1913 is a key spring. December 1912 is going to be a key December in terms of December 2018. So 1913 is a very important spring, and is very unsettled spring. Reminder of what 1913 was like. Deep area below average heights owing to west of the country, bring the jet stream through like that. It looks like that was a very, very unsettled spring indeed. Our next spring is 1923, following on from December 1922, which had 109 to 120 millimetres. The spring of 1923 also has this area of below average heights over to the south of the UK through Western Europe, and a bit of a blocking signal up to the north. Probably relatively unsettled again with that particular spring. Then we've got 1949, so this looks like a decent spring. This has above average heights ridging up from the Azores into the west of Europe. We've got below average heights locked in around Greenland and Iceland. The jet stream is up there, so on the mild side of the jet stream. And that's a pretty decent pattern. Of course, the summer of 1949 was a very warm summer as well, and it looks like the pattern for that summer started to get going in the spring of 1949. Then we got the spring of 1956 coming up next. So this one again has above average heights centered almost over top of the UK. Very dry spring in 1956. It all flipped in the summer and turned very cold and very wet. But the spring of 1956 actually wasn't too bad, with high pressure bringing a fair amount of dry weather. And this one looks quite nice as well for the spring. This is the spring of 1961, following on from December 1960. And this one has above average heights covering the UK and most of Central Western Europe. Below average heights are out in the Atlantic and away over Scandinavia. So again, we're on the mild side of a jet stream there. A lot of dry and pleasantly warm weather through the spring of 1961. 1967 turns up next for this Analogues package with below average heights a little bit to our northeast, above average heights in the Atlantic. I think this is just a relatively sort of westerly, relatively mild spring. Nothing particularly dramatic going on there. Then we've got the spring of 1973, following on from December 1972, which had, again, England and Wales rainfall of between 109 and 120 millimetres. This one has above average heights out to the west, below average heights to the east. So probably relatively dry. The Atlantic is blocked off. And with an Atlantic flow, I suppose, quite mild as well. At times, possibly pulling down some colder air from the north, but I think just a relatively quiet and not particularly exciting spring in 1973. The early 1970s are a very dismal decade for weather, really. The last significant event that took place in the early 70s was the White Christmas of 1970, and then 1971, 1972, 1973, 1974, all sort of forgotten years, really, where not a great deal happened. I mean, it all gets a lot more interesting as you get through to 1975. You start to get those very hot summers coming along, and then, of course, later in the decade, from 77 onwards, things start getting much colder with the winters as well. But the early 70s are kind of forgotten, with not a great deal happening, to be honest. The next spring is 1983. This is a much more unsettled spring, quite a cold spring as well. So it has a blocking feature just to the south of Greenland with a trough over the UK. And we pull down the jet stream, so we go onto the cold side of the jet stream with that spring. There's a really cold spell through March and into April of 1983, and also very wet during that spring as well. Didn't mean anything for the summer, though. It's a very hot summer, of course. And then the spring of 2007 turns up after December 2006. So this one, a very settled spring with above average heights centred from the Atlantic into much of northern Europe. The below average heights are out to the northwest. It contains a very warm and dry April, and then things start to flip in May. And of course, the May of 2007 begins to set up that exceptionally wet summer that we had in 2007. But for most of that spring, there's a lot of dry and very mild. In fact, in April 2007, you would even say warm weather. The spring of 2012 turns up next, and this one has above average heights very close to the UK. It's an interesting spring, 2012. March was very mild and exceptionally dry. There was actually a winter drought, and then it turned much wetter in April and quite a lot colder as well. And then May 2012, I think, was somewhere in between, but there was some pretty warm weather in May 2012 as well. So when you bring it all together, you come up with a height anomaly like that, but there's a lot of intra-month variation going on in the spring of 2012. And then finally, we've got last spring, 2018, showing up. So this one has below average heights out to our west, above average heights setting up the pattern of the summer, of course, to our east, bringing up very mild southerly winds. So this is an interesting spring because, of course, we have a cold March with the beach from the east right at the very beginning of the spring. Then April is very wet but also really warm, and then May is very warm but also much drier in May 2018. So again, quite a lot of intra-month variation going on, but you can see the broad pattern of the spring, and you can see why it was a pretty warm spring, because obviously the air is being sucked up from southern parts of Europe, and it's just setting up the pattern of the summer of 2018, of course. So bringing all of those together, this is what we see when we combine all of the years for March. And it looks like a nice signal for March, actually, with above average heights centred almost over the top of the country. Below average heights are away to the northwest. We're on the mild side of the jet stream, so we'd expect a lot of dry and pretty warm conditions, I have to say, or mild, very mild conditions during March. April then goes much more unsettled, with below average heights extending as a trough from Northern Europe down to Southern Europe. There's a little bit of a blocking signal as well in the April. So after that dry and very mild signal for March, it looks like April probably turns quite a lot more unsettled and potentially quite a bit colder too. And then this goes on into May. In fact, in May, the blocking signal strengthens further around Greenland and the North Atlantic, and the trough deepens over the UK. So it looks like a deteriorating pattern really through the springs, with a lot of dry and mild weather in March, deteriorating somewhat in April, and finishing up with a very unsettled signal during the course of May. Finally, putting all of that together, this is how we come out. So for the springs overall, quite an unsettled signal, bit of a blocking signal to the south of Greenland, with below average heights extending into the UK. Bear in mind, again, we have got a much drier signal for March, and we've got a high pressure signal for March, and then a deteriorating signal through April and through May too. And that's it for our first batch of spring 2019 analogues. So we're off and running at long last with your spring analogues. As I say, we're going to try and get as much data together as we can between now and the end of the month. Obviously, the last Sunday in February is when we've got to release the spring forecast, so we haven't got very long at all to bring the data to you. We're going to do as much as we can, and we'll just see as we get to the end of the month whether we think we've got enough data to be able to give you a forecast, or whether we've got to say, actually, no, sorry, we can't come up with a reliable signal for this season, and we'll have to sit it out if that is the case. But we'll let you know as we go further on into the month exactly how things are looking in terms of the spring forecast. What we can say is that shutdowns permitting, as long as there's no more bust-ups over the Donald's Wall, we will be able to bring you regular summer updates from the start of March. And so I'm hoping, fingers crossed, everything's going to settle down now over in the States, and we'll be able to keep the reanalysis pages open at NOAA. If that is the case, then there'll be no problem bringing you summer updates, and ultimately at the end of May, a summer forecast. And the summer updates will begin, as I say, at the start of March. To set the scene and begin to just think about it a little bit, we've got a little bit of a summer update coming up for you this afternoon, probably around 3 or 4 o'clock. So it's just a bit of fun, really, but do have a look at that if you would like to. In between now and then, we're going to have Gazzo's City Roundup, and then tonight we've got Ensembles Watch. This video will be placed on the spring updates and potential forecast page with a written summary later on today, probably sometime this evening, so come back for that then. The Sunny Roundup is the next video up in 2 or 3 hours. That's all for now though, and thanks for watching.